Welcome to MHN Voices, our series through which we present insightful discussions among industry thought leaders, moderated by our editorial team. I'm Suzanne Silverman, Editorial Director of Multi-Housing News, and our expert panel today includes Paul Fiorilla, Director of Research at Yardi Matrix, to provide us with some sector performance data, plus developers Matt Sullivan, COO of the Michaels Organization, Jeffrey Woda, principal of Woda Cooper Companies, and Timothy Henkel, president of Pennrose. We're recording this session and it'll be available for later viewing. In addition, we're going to leave some time at the end to answer your questions, but please feel free to submit them at any time during the webinar, and please don't be shy. Thank you to those of you who submitted some in advance, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Let's start with Paul's presentation of the data, and then we'll discuss the issues. Paul, I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks, Sue. It's great to be here. Good afternoon to everyone. So to start, how did we get here, right? Rents are rising faster than incomes, which means that a greater share of renters have become cost burden in recent years. And what that generally means that they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. Next slide. It's a bigger problem in some markets than in others. It's also a bigger problem in renters of renter by necessity units, which are lower income tenants and properties, B and C properties that are less expensive. So as you can see, this is just a selection of markets, but it's these are some of the markets that have the highest rent to income ratios. Next slide. So to address this issue, policymakers across the country have increased development of partially and fully affordable apartment properties over the last decade. So this includes public housing authorities or properties built with tax credits such as LIHTC or subsidies such as Section 8, in which the developer agrees to limit rents to a percentage of area media income. That's generally the definition of affordable. And some properties are partially affordable, not have a portion of the units that are subject to these limits, and so other properties are fully affordable, where all the units in the property are subject to the limits. Next slide. So our forecast is that fully affordable unit completions will peak next year at about 74,000 and then start to drop again. Next slide. As the affordable development is subject to the same conditions that are causing a drop in starts in market rate properties. There are issues with costs of materials, availability and cost of labor, financing availability, cost of financing. So we're set to see a slowdown in starts of affordable units. Now, as this is a growing issue, and we're going to talk, the other panels are going to talk a lot more about this, but some of the things that can be done to get back up some more affordable development include increased funding of LIHTC, preserving existing affordable housing, direct subsidies, expanding opportunity zones. So the next administration will be dealing with a lot of these issues, and what they do is going to play a big role in the development and the number of deliveries of both fully and partially affordable units we see going forward. And a lot of it is also on states and municipalities. So at Matrix, we have a database of about 3.3 million affordable units, more than 25,000 properties. We've done a couple of research studies in recent months on this. One of them is about, we looked at the competitiveness of market rate properties with affordable by market. And kind of surprisingly, we saw there's a big gap. So there's some metros in which conventional market rate properties are much more competitive with affordable. In other words, the rents are closer to affordable property rents. And if you go to the next slide, I don't have the time to explain the entire methodology, but basically what we did is we looked at the fully affordable private sector rents, the average maximum allowable rents in those properties by market, and then we compared it to different quality stratas of conventional rents. And when the stratas in which the prices, the average rents were closer, or a certain percentage closer to the affordable rents, we considered that to be competitive. And if you can go back up to the previous slide, go backwards one slide, so there was a huge difference between markets in what percentage of properties were competitive with affordable properties. And basically, there were three factors that I'll very briefly go over that went into that competitiveness. One of them was just the cost per market. So like really expensive markets like San Francisco and New York, New Jersey, Miami, where there's a huge gap between conventional rents and affordable rents. There was very little conventional product competitive with affordable. Another factor was amount of supply. In markets that have a lot of supply, like Austin is an example, there's a lot more market response to the affordability issue, and therefore you get more market rate properties that are affordable, closer in price to the affordable maximum allowable rents. A third factor is just the timing of when stock was built. So markets where there was a large percentage of stock that were built a long time ago, where most of the stock is older, and Baltimore might be an example of that. There's a lot of naturally occurring affordable stock that is competitive, sort of like B minus C quality properties, that makes it a greater percentage of the apartment stock in those markets are therefore more competitive. But the factors differ in every market. There's not like a correlation that all these factors are present in all markets. So the next slide, and then the next slide. So for example, when we were talking about Austin, right, there's the conventional properties are unusually competitive in Austin with affordable properties. And so you can see on the affordable occupancy rate of affordable units in Austin is actually fairly weak compared to conventional. And next slide. And now the reverse of that would be Miami, which is an expensive market for conventional rents. And you can see because there's such a dearth of affordable properties there, the occupancy rate in affordable properties are 98%. So it's important to look at local market factors when you're dealing with affordable development, just like you do with market rate development. Next slide. A second area of research that we've done with our new affordable database is we've looked at the expense versus income growth in recent years. And with the general increase in inflation and building costs and everything, particularly the increase in insurance rates, expenses, the rate of growth of expenses has outstripped the increase in income in recent years, although that reversed a little bit this last year in 2024, where you can see expenses are beginning to decelerate. Expense growth is beginning to decelerate, but income growth was fairly high. Next slide. The biggest driver, now there's a lot of reasons insurance expenses are going up. The biggest factor is insurance. They've gone up about 130% over the last combined over the last 5 years. Next slide. And a lot of that was led by the markets in the Southeast, Southwest, and West, where you have a lot of weather-related damages that are creating, large payouts for insurers. These insurance increases have started to moderate, but there's been such a big increase in recent years. It's a growing problem. And the reason why this is such a big factor in the affordable world, it's important for conventional owners too, but in the affordable world, on average, expenses comprise a greater share of income than in conventional properties. And the national average is about 57% for affordable properties compared to about 43% for conventional properties. And in most some markets, the gap is even wider. You look at some of the markets on the left, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Indianapolis, where there's a huge gap between market and market rate and affordable properties in terms of how much of the income is taken up by expenses. Next slide. And in the one good news for affordable property owners is that the maximum allowable rents are set by a formula that includes inflation, and it's based on inflation, and it's lagging a couple of years. So some of the big increases in inflation that we saw over 21, 22 are now beginning to show up in the formula that allows affordable owners to increase rents to make up for these increases in expenses. So in 2024, through 3 quarters, income growth has been fairly strong. It's been about 9%, which has enabled NOI growth to go up about 7% year over year. So that's a good sign. But the fact is that those kind of rent increases are not going to be allowed forever, and that means that taking action to reduce expenses, operate more efficiently is going to be a big part of ownership of affordable units going forward. So that's the slides. If anyone wants to, to see some of the research papers that we've done, send me an email or look up on the Matrix Publications page. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for setting the stage, Paul. Now let's hear from our developers about what you're doing and what you're seeing and anticipating. And Tim, why don't we start with you? Can you tell us how you focused your strategy and how that might change in the new year?
Yeah, I guess we would define our strategy right now as still a post-COVID strategy, which to us means we're in a longer cycle. So our business has become long cycle instead of, as a development business, we've always been a longer cycle than maybe many industries, but it's even longer with an unusual exposure to volatility. So we're still carrying that forward, and our strategies really are about addressing those kinds of things. And so strategically, we're looking a lot shorter term. We're looking a lot more forward in our pipeline than deeper in our pipeline, focusing more on executing what we have than building, what could be, closings 2 or 3 years out. And that's because the pace of that cycle, the pace of our throughput in the affordable housing business has slowed. And we're not seeing that necessarily coming back all the way to normal. I would say we're seeing it coming back a little, which is nice, but it hasn't come back all the way. And that has us then emphasizing really a bias on execution, strategically looking at how do we make sure that we're bringing everyone along, everyone in the capital stack, and every part of the process needs to be really emphasized from many, many points of communication in ways that I think were always important to our business, but it's just definitely an emphasis and a strategy that we have right now. And then the final point of strategy, which again is not something that's new or foreign, but almost more important, we feel like now, is just to always be looking for another source. Because we have an exposure to a cost differential, time, and the adage is that time doesn't help our deals, is that we always want to be making our entrees to additional sources that we're eligible for. We could talk about some of those sources later, but that's become a very ready strategy for us almost across the board. And sorry, Suzanne, in terms of change, sure. I don't see that changing, anytime, really very, very soon. It's the thing that I think we feel like we have to do now, and that's where we're focused on.
Okay, thanks. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, we're much the same way as Tim. Our primary focus this year has been focusing on closing existing deals. that were delayed due to the lingering effects of COVID. Going forward, our focus will shift more to building our strong pipeline while applying those lessons learned from the challenges that we faced in the previous deals. Many people know Michaels through our public housing developments. For the past decade or so, we've refined our focus on developments that don't take as much time. As Tim mentioned, time is not our friend, to work through the pipeline, focusing more on straight LIHTC deals and being more selective with our PHA sponsors. Furthermore, as a natural progression from our robust affordable business and a link between our affordable portfolio and our luxury market rate portfolio, we remain steadfastly focused on our attainable housing solutions, working with private enterprise and municipalities and the healthcare industry to solve their lowercase a affordable housing problems. And Paul mentioned a lot of this earlier, but as the real estate industry continues to face challenges with high interest rates, equity and debt financing, persistently high construction and labor costs, and an evolving insurance environment, and concerning trends and vacancies and delinquencies across the board. But I believe our approach here at Michaels to tackle these problems creatively and head on is a primary reason why our development pipeline now stands at roughly $4 billion across all of our asset classes, and our partners and stakeholders continue to put their trust in Michaels to execute.
All right, thank you. And Jeff, what about you?
So this year we'll probably have our biggest year of getting deals funded either through 9% credits or 4s with soft funds. So we're still full force ahead. We are looking at the new year and really taking a hard look at state programs, both their 9s through their QAPs and what they provide with 4s and soft funds and state credits. And quite frankly, if the program no longer makes sense for us and we can't figure out a way to make the deal work, we'll sit out a cycle or two in those states and not just do a deal for the sake of doing a deal. There's a lot of QAPs that require things that were maybe written before COVID that have remained in those QAPs. So where those 9% deals don't make sense, we're not going to pursue those. As Tim mentioned, it's continuing to look for soft funds, states that add state credits to their credit allocation to help bridge that gap in our capital stacks. We also are really taking a hard look at how the states and local governments handle evictions. We've got several areas that we've developed in that it's much harder now to evict a resident who hasn't paid their rent for a prolonged amount of time. And, that's very troubling to us. So we're also taking that into account now as we choose jurisdictions where to develop on a go-forward basis. And finally, we're probably, because of COVID, we really started looking at collections from a very high level down and really put collections under a microscope, which has now led us to really look at tenant quality and tenant credit quality. Probably for the first time in our history, that has become one major factor in our management side.
Interesting. Jeff, what have you seen to be the greatest challenges in the current market in developing affordable housing, and how do you see those changing in the new year?
Yeah, I think Matt ticked off a few. So if I repeat some of the things he said, forgive me, because I didn't list them here and tick off the ones he said. But, all of us have experienced in the affordable housing world, the escalating construction costs and the shrinking labor force that has pushed costs up, I think, beyond our wildest dreams 5 years ago. The supply chain challenges still exist. We still have several projects right now that we can't get finished because we're missing a piece or a part that's vital to getting a certificate of occupancy. The other is, as my colleagues mentioned, just how long it takes now to get something from award to entitlement. I think due to COVID, jurisdictions, bureaucracies changed their work ethics on as far as employees maybe now aren't in the office, they're trying to do it remotely. There's nothing worse than trying to get a plan review from somebody that's working remotely now that isn't engaged the way they were previously. I'm sure it's a challenge for them as well. So, we're really looking at that timeline of how long it takes us to get in the ground from the day we get funded. Matt definitely mentioned interest rates. I think interest rates now are a far bigger challenge than any of us ever saw. Hopefully, We're seeing the Fed with some rate cuts. Hopefully some long-term rates will start coming down next year to ease that. The value of the credits, the credits aren't bringing the same amount of equity to the capital stack that they used to. It is good, I think, that the CRA reform is now put on hold. Maybe that'll keep some CRA markets still pretty healthy on the value of the credits, but across the board, that's a challenge. Losing soft sources. A lot of jurisdictions we work in right now, we're able to bridge the gaps through using ARP or home ARP or some other fund that was, or some other source of funds that was created during the COVID era, and those are all coming to an end. So we're really nervous as to how jurisdictions, state and local governments will fund those gaps without having those resources available. And then, as I said, looking at our strategy, we're really focusing on markets where there's softening of higher rents. We got income averaging. We were able to go up to 80% rents, but as we found out, there's not many markets where you're going to get an 80% rent. So again, that tenant quality and that ability to really collect that rent that you've put in that pro forma, we see that as a real challenge here over the next 12 to 24 months.
Okay, thanks. Anybody have anything to add before we move on? All right, that was a pretty thorough list. Thank you. Matt, what approaches have you taken to make development more cost effective? Or have you implemented any new strategies? And you may have mentioned that is part of your overall strategy earlier, but let's focus on that.
Yeah, for sure.
Element.
Simply put, focus on existing relationships, right? So while the industry saw, as Paul pointed out earlier, 20 to 30% increases in insurance premiums in 24 alone, and an incredible, I think I heard 137% since the pre-COVID era, we actually saw an 18% reduction in our premiums in 2024. And that's a result of long-term insurance partnerships and successful negotiations with the marketplace and measured risk mitigation throughout our portfolio. So by having stable and predictable, relatively stable and relatively predictable insurance premiums, our development teams can have the confidence going into the development process, which, as we've noted, can sometimes take years, that their underwritten premiums are sufficient in today's marketplace. And that focus on relationships certainly extends to our procurement teams. So strategic procurement of building materials and leveraging of our national portfolio with material suppliers has helped us to achieve better pricing and terms while avoiding some major supply chain issues. We've implemented a vertically integrated approach to design, development, and construction to be able to construct more efficient communities and control our costs. We also have a renewed focus on tax credit resyndications to preserve affordability and quality in our existing affordable housing for many years to come. By preserving affordable housing as close to year 15 as possible, we're able to tackle aging affordable housing properties before the reserves are too depleted or before rehab costs balloon to unaffordable levels. And lastly, on the resident side, we've implemented social services at nearly every property to assist tenants to stay current in their rent by providing technical support and applying for rental assistance programs, job training, and even after-school programs.
Okay, thanks. Tim, what are you most concerned about in the coming year, and what do you see as
So if I
likely to
could
be
just
Sure.
to Matt's point, I'm sorry, about insurance, some of the things that property owners are doing to lessen the increase in insurance include like negotiating sort of portfolio level insurance or increasing deductibles, engaging a broker to help negotiate with the insurance companies, taking proactive measures on things like safety and security so you don't have as many claims and things like that. So that's, given the rapid increases, a lot of owners are taking those kind of steps and more to mitigate those increases.
Paul, it is interesting. We used to have a blanket policy over our entire portfolio, and through the years, that actually turned against us. So we've gone to individual policies because some states are viewed as a much higher risk than others. And sometimes you're paying across the board for those higher risk states. The other thing my business partner implemented long ago was claims management. We really have a pretty intense reporting process that goes through whenever a claim is filed. We have an agreement with our insurer that we have the first shot at resolving the claim before it becomes a claim, because obviously the frequency of claims is what's driving up premiums for many of the insureds across our portfolio and across our industry. So we really do a good job in someone claims they had a slip and fall. They want to know the name of our insurance agent. We immediately we'll find the we have cameras just about everywhere now. We'll dispute their claim, and we try to mitigate that claim ever before it gets to our insurance company.
And Matt, I was going to ask you some more about insurance, in fact. So I don't know if there's anything that Paul and Jeff didn't mention that you wanted to add.
Yeah, no, that's all spot on. The trend in the industry is to push deductibles higher and higher to help lower the premiums. One thing we did, I guess we had the foresight to do many years ago, is we established a captive insurer within Michaels to more or less operate as a nonprofit and help buy down the deductibles on a lot of our properties at a cost that's much more reasonable to do so than if we had gone to the open market.
Kim, anything further to add on insurance? Certainly a big issue these
Well,
days.
like I'm trying to resist the urge of turning a development panel into an insurance panel. I think it's really, it really tells the story though, that whenever you talk to people about affordable housing, people like us who are on the production side of that business, it's almost impossible not to get into a conversation about portfolio strength, portfolio stability, because the number of simultaneous issues that we're dealing with in a low margin business, which I think is like the key to the conversation. When Paul presents that information, he's basically showing us, hey, you can't restrict your rents to restrict your revenue stream and then have inordinate increases, in double digit levels on the expense side. It's like we're not, those deals were never engineered financially to survive that kind of thing. And so the amount of time that's being spent on the asset management side, in each of those silos of expenses, this conversation will quickly veer into not just, revenue management, insurance management, claims management, utility management, and all those kinds of things, all worthy places to address, what's going on in our portfolio. But it's really about trying to make sure we squeeze that side as hard as we can without failing to deliver, the service, which is the management of the property on behalf of our residents, our employees, our lenders and investors. And so it's a strained point. Your question to me was, what am I most concerned about?
Besides insurance, what are you most concerned about?
Yeah. Jeff mentioned this before. I mean, I think we are running out of some of the era resources. And so, our industry has a historic cycle of, whenever there's whenever the bottom falls out, there's a rescue plan and things happen. That has certainly been the post-COVID case. A lot of good things that came out. We can go back to our TCAP and tax credit exchange experiences. And so, something good always happens to help is somewhat reassuring, but not certainly reassuring enough. And so I would say my biggest concern is that there's residual volatility, that we're looking going, being hopeful, but that our capital stacks aren't necessarily following a rhythm, a recipe, a certain path. And that puts a lot of stress on all those funding agencies, all of our financial partners who are asking, to have to think differently already about different sources, 45L credits and GRRF funds and all the things that we're trying to bring to the deals to make them feasible, affect volatility. And to go back to my first comment, what we're trying to deliver is certainty of execution, because it really is our one cost control measure. It's really the one thing we can do, is like to figure out how we can squeeze those construction costs, down to their lowest possible level, is to be able to say, this is when we're going to close. This is when you're going to build it. To exert financial pressure on the construction side of things without like a known start and finish date, it's really difficult. How much is it going to cost? Well, when am I going to build it? I'll tell you when I get my last dollar in. And so that's been a real a real difficulty. And so that's my concern. So what we're trying to do is deliver certainty to to that table and to say, we've got it figured out, we're close enough, and we're going to get there. But there are threats to that certainty, and that's the battle we're doing every day.
Jeff, can you just tell us briefly, because I know in our planning calls, we talked about how this could be a whole nother webinar. Can you briefly tell us your thoughts on the NAHB's 10-point plan to ease the affordability crisis? Because that's certainly the issue we're all trying to address. And from your perspective, can it help developers add housing that's affordable yet financially feasible, which is, of course, what we need to make paramount in business while trying to address that shortage?
Sure, I've been a member of the home builders for decades. I'm the chair of the Ohio Home Builders Multifamily, and we've been members of the Housing Credit Group of the National Association of Home Builders, so very familiar. Suzanne, I didn't think you wanted me to go through all 10 points, so I tried to pick out 3 that I thought would be most worthwhile for us to discuss. And one is eliminate excess regulations. On average, regulations account for nearly 25% of the cost of a single family home and more than 40% of the cost of a typical apartment development. So in our industry, we're never going to get rid of all the regulations because it is a public-private partnership. But what we've seen over the last 4 years is just a lot more regulations from a lot other departments of the government, both local, state, and federal, that we've had to deal with that we didn't have to deal with previous to that. And I think not only does it cost us in raw dollars, but it also, as my colleagues mentioned, it's cost us a lot of time, and time is dollars in this market with the uncertainty of interest rates and the uncertainty of funding of programs. Time's huge. So the more we can reduce those regulations to get from award to getting into the ground and getting through that, the quicker, I think the more successful our developments will be. The second one that I picked out of the 10 was to fix the building material supply chains and ease costs. And I really wanted to focus on ease costs. With inflation going up the way it did, will we ever see a relaxing of prices? Is this the new norm where we are today? Will costs ever ease? The cost of building materials has surged 38% since the pandemic, according to the NAHB, and according to our records, it's even higher than that. And we had a 4-fold lumber spike in 2021, adding more than about $30,000 to the average price of a unit. So, that is really a big number for us to stomach as we're putting our sources and uses together. How do we bridge that? And we've only been able to do it with those resources that Tim described, that our industry kind of bailed us out and helped us get through those times. But we don't see that on the horizon right now. We hope it'll be there. But if there's a way we could ease costs, I think that would be a big contributor to help us make our numbers work. And finally, this one's probably very self-serving for this panel, but I thought I couldn't resist pass federal tax legislation to expand the production of affordable and attainable housing. We participate in the tax credit program any way that we can expand that to make more credits available per development. It's going to help us bring more capital. And then NAHB also supports bipartisan proposals to create a new tax credit to produce affordable workforce rental housing geared toward middle-income households, such as teachers, healthcare professionals, and law enforcement. I think we've all been in communities where they understand that the credit serves that 30 to 80% household, but what do we do from the 80 to the 100? Kind of that missing middle that a lot of jurisdictions, as we propose our housing, has challenged us on how to house. So if we can get more legislation that helps us expand what we've already created, which I think is the greatest housing program in the history of our country, which is the low-income housing tax credit, and then create new credits to incentivize us to look at other ways to house those that need it most in America.
Thanks. Yeah, that is certainly all important. Earlier, Paul referenced the importance of looking at local market factors, and I know all of you have expressed similar concerns during our planning meetings, looking at the state and the local level to fill the financing gap. Tim, what are your biggest financing concerns, and what are the most effective steps you've seen at the state or local level to fill the financing gap?
Yeah, I mean, just as Jeff puts in the obligatory plea for expansion of the tax credit program, there is the concern of investor appetite, the relaxing of aggressive reform at the CRA level is helpful. But I think that investor appetite is something that we have to keep an eye on as we add, not just ask for additions to tax credits, in the low-income housing, the federal program, but also other tax credits that are out there. So the energy tax credits are eroding a little bit of the appetite right now on the investor level. So that's a concern, as we try and meet this need. The other thing is that the program's success on the 30-40 year history that Jeff just referenced is really based on the stability of the assets in it, right? It's a comfortable place to be. These are assets that have been, it's a public-private partnership of great success. And some of the operational pressures that are on it now threaten that that visibility, right? If our affordable housing resources begin to be looked at as something that is in a different risk quadrant in the risk reward for parameters, that would really be a difficulty. I realize that you just asked me 3 concern questions in a row. So I'm gonna swing for the fences with a little optimism.
Sorry about that.
When well, that guy's really way down on stuff. So you asked about the effective steps that we've seen to address gaps. I do think locally, state and local, so state, county, and on the municipal level, there's just a really renewed, well, I shouldn't say renewed, there's a new level of interest in solving housing issues, with some immediacy. And so I think it's useful in our effort to push things towards immediate closings and getting there quickly to have I think a fairly widespread attitude change on the local level. There are more indifferent unhoused people than there have ever been before, and so I think people can see them, and when we know them, and it's not an othering of our residential population. And so finding those solutions seems to be really it's really in everyone's interest. Everyone can see the sort of the tax on the system. If the system is society of not housing folks, how do we educate them? How do we feed them? How do we care for them? If we can't even house them, seems to be really a very present conversation. And I think that's good. It's not the whole solution, but it tends to help us power through, some difficult moments sometimes. And I'm encouraged by that. It feels good in an industry that we've always thought was worthy. We're in it for all the right reasons, and so it's good to have a little more support. One thing I would add, though, not to get back on the pro-con side of the ledger here, but Jeff referenced the request to get into that 80 to 120 mix. That is on the tip of the tongue of many of the local leaders. They're not trying to house just a segment of their population. It's a broader group. And so when you try and get the 80 to 120 mix into a bond deal or a tax credit deal, it's a layer of complexity where it's already complicated. And so I think in a lot of places, in a lot of ways, we're on our way to figuring that out as an industry. But along with the willpower that's coming, there's a little bit of a complication that we're having to deal with and having to have folks understand.
Jeff, Matt, any other things you've seen, maybe any specific examples at the state or local level that's helping to fill the financing gap? Anything maybe that can be applied elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tim, right? The renewed attention and resolve at the state and local level is super important for our industry to continue to get affordable housing deals done. One of the more effective steps I've seen states take to fill the financing gap is the introduction of state tax credits in states like Arizona and Indiana and South Carolina.
Ohio.
In Ohio too, yep. These state tax credits have been a huge help in filling the financing gaps on our re-syndications and new development underwriting. However, I think the downside is that I believe the state tax credits have been so popular that they've been a much larger hit to the state's revenue than they probably were initially expecting, and resulted in some tax credit caps. Outside of state tax credits, we've seen success in locally funded housing trust funds, especially here in New Jersey, and local government use of ARPA funds for emergency rental assistance and housing choice vouchers, and even soft funds, which many of our affordable development deals rely on to help get these deals to pencil.
Suzanne, I think your next question was on municipalities, and I think it ties right in with this question of what we've seen them do. We have seen them waive fees or really lessen tap fees, permit fees, zoning fees, etc. We've seen tax abatements or pilots where we can get significantly reduced real estate taxes over the initial compliance period of 15 years, which helps us leverage more debt. Zoning approvals, I think we've experienced some quicker zoning approvals for affordable housing than maybe some of our competitors doing market rate housing. Also with variances, we've got a really good history of getting variances in zoning, probably a lot quicker than trying to do a market rate deal in some jurisdictions. We've also seen sales tax exemptions where different states have different programs on how you're able to leverage a sales tax exemption so your contractor doesn't have to pay sales tax on all their materials. And I think Matt mentioned local home funds, local CDBG funds, various local funds that maybe before they were using for other purposes, but now they're repurposing those towards helping developers make their capital stacks work for affordable housing developments. And then finally, we've even seen down to the level of where we've seen local municipalities give us really far below market parking leases and even some of our commercial space leases. So we didn't have to go into the market and get those at a market rate. We were able to get something that was much more beneficial to the development. And that was a local municipality helping us do that.
Jeff, that's spot on, right? From the municipal standpoint, it seems like every elected politician says they want more affordable housing units, which is great, as long as those words lead to action. And now more and more municipalities are saying they want developers to solve their attainable housing crisis for them, or the missing middle, as we've been talking about, the 80 to 120% AMIs. And in my mind, in order for those partnerships to work, either for affordable or attainable housing, we need some combination of the following. And Jeff, you mentioned a lot of these, but in my mind, it's free or reduced cost land, some sort of tax abatement, waived or discounted permit or connection fees, flexibility with subordinate debt financing. And lastly, I would add one, and that's the resolve to get the deals done. One deal that we're working with the city of Philadelphia on right now for 3 of our properties would not be moving forward without resubordinating the debt. The city's been reasonable and flexible about preservation terms and the cost of the projects. And as a result, the city gets a commitment to the long-term preservation of affordable housing at these properties, and we get renewed and restored assets by the money that we're putting back into them. For attainable deals, municipalities are providing greater leadership because attainable housing is so beneficial to their overall economy. They're providing things like exemptions, pilots, and the like, but they've not yet found a way to put cash into new deals. So if we can solve that, I think a lot of these attainable housing deals would go a long way. We also need housing finance agencies to be more flexible on increasing the developer fee caps and recognizing that the development costs and operating expenses across the board have drastically increased over the last few years, resulting in the need for increased caps. But at the end of the day, municipal partners are looking for history and a track record of performance and innovative approaches in executing projects. And since many of these public-private partnerships, are intended to solve many of these different housing solutions all at once, municipal partners are looking for sponsors who can provide the whole range of product type.
Okay, thank you. We are going to turn to Q&A in a few minutes. So if anybody has any further questions that they would like to ask the panel, please do enter them in that Q&A window. And and we'll try to get to as many as we can, as I mentioned earlier. Because we are running out of time, I would like to talk some about conversions to affordable housing, whether from market rate or other property types, and talk about what you're encountering there. And Jeff, maybe I could start with you on that topic.
Sure. This has become a very large line of business here at Woda Cooper Companies for us. We have multiple buildings that were either office conversions or other types of downtown commercial buildings that we're converting to affordable housing. And it's more expensive than building ground up. There's no argument there. It does take a lot of resources to make it work. But I think what we're seeing, planners and elected officials and those that are the forefathers of the community see is if they've got this empty building sitting there and that area of town doesn't have the businesses, the one way you get the businesses is to bring the bodies. To bring the bodies, you have to have the housing. So we have multiple buildings here in Columbus we're working on. The city of Pittsburgh, through their URA, has a downtown office conversion program that we're participating in. We're seeing a lot of communities really incentivize us to go and repurpose a 90 to 80% vacant office or other type of building into affordable housing. And I really think, with where we're seeing vacancies in the office market as a whole, it makes a lot of sense because, again, if we're going, the building sitting there, it's not being used. Let's at least make it something that can be very useful in that community.
And Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would
regarding
add to
conversions?
that HFC and PFC executions, they currently dominate the market for affordable conversions in some states like Texas. And while the ground lease and government ownership components of the structure may discourage some conventional sponsors and investors from converting some of these housing units to affordable, many still see the significant benefit of achieving 100% tax abatement in exchange for about 50% income restrictions. Also in California, it's not novel in any way, but there's a state exemption that allows for an alternative approach, which requires income and rent restrictions and the inclusion of a nonprofit in the ownership structure and some sort of government funding. That results in a pro rata tax abatement proportional to the percentage of qualifying low income residents. The program is generally a little bit less appealing. Impact funds are increasingly targeting this type of development across the West Coast, where the costs are far outpacing much of Middle America. Overall, though, these types of development executions demand a sponsor with expertise in working with housing authorities and nonprofits and navigating rent, income qualification, and compliance requirements while managing the traditional complexities of project acquisition and development that Michael's does a lot of.
I
Tim,
can jump in
anything?
there. Yeah, just a little bit to round out the edges. I mean, Jeff is right. Like those conversions are not necessarily a place to save money. But the locations are often really, really important. I think you were referring to that, Jeff. Taking that neighborhood assets and repurposing them for affordable housing is not a new strategy. It's what's new is that they can be done at scale. They tend to be high rises. They're office buildings that are, they've suffered the COVID related vacancies. And it's a distress, and it's a distress it takes bodies off of the streets. And so it's really good stuff. Unfortunately, I think a statistic I've heard is that only about 30% of like the vacant office stock is actually convertible without any real crazy efforts, and that has to do with core space and envelopes and things like that, depth of floor plan. So it's not a silver bullet, but like seeing them get done is really pretty rewarding. And then on the other side of the preservation, I guess what we'd call it part of affordable housing is that statistically we know that there are portfolios of properties and general partners who are into an age cohort where they're going to transact. And so that volume of movement is an opportunity, I think, for there to be, sort of another source of supply. And I'm not talking necessarily about just affordable housing units maintaining their affordability, but whatever we want to call it, B class, naturally occurring affordable housing, naturally occurring affordable housing becoming income restricted housing that we can rely on, for the coming years. So it's one of the, it's one of the other wells that I think as an industry we're going to address the supply issue.
Okay, let's turn to some questions from the audience. And one, in fact, does relate to conversions. So I'm going to start with that one, which is asking about conversion from hotel to affordable housing, because you already, whoops, 1 second. The question just jumped as somebody added one in. Well, you already have some of the infrastructure in place. So does that make it more viable?
I mean, we've looked at 1,000 of them. I don't know if you guys have done them. They're one of the more difficult conversions. They're not impossible. There's a depth of floor plan that makes it difficult. So the unit you end up creating out of a hotel room tends to be wide, right? It tends to be like wide frontage on the building because it's not very deep from door to window. And that's not, of course, universally true, but it is often very true. And creates a difficulty. And so your yield is not necessarily often what you want it to be, and you're not very often able to use the existing floor plan of that housing unit. Now, that gets into a QAP question, because that hotel room could be a very nice, call it a micro unit, a tiny house on a floor plan or something like that. But for sure, there's no QAP written that's going to allow that unit size to generate tax credits. It's very unusual for a unit sizing to allow that to happen. And that's where a little bend on a QAP could create some real housing opportunity.
What are your strategies for acquiring or developing in opportunity zones for 2025? Any of you, whoever wants to take that one.
I would say simply it's not driving our strategy. That we know what to do for an OZ, and how to try to maximize those benefits to the benefit of the project, but it's not generally dragging us to places we wouldn't otherwise go. We check, we make sure that we know if we're an OZ or not, but otherwise it's not driving our strategy.
I would say the same, Tim. It's not driving our strategy either. It's a nice ancillary benefit to have, but it doesn't dictate our development or acquisition strategy.
There are some QAPs that give some extra points if you're in an opportunity zone. So obviously those states, we are looking for opportunity zones first. We've done a couple opportunity zone only deals without credits. And I think to get that value, we need a re-up of the opportunity zone benefits, because now we've gotten to the point, I think the benefits are so diminished, they're not near as valuable as they were. So if we could get that re-upped, I think that could generate in some opportunity zones some of that missing middle housing like we talked about earlier.
Okay,
I mean,
now,
that's really obvious,
sorry,
kind
go
of an
ahead.
obvious point, Suzanne. It's a sunsetting program, right? So you're going to be hard pressed to rely on the benefits if it's not extended.
But
Certainly has diminished
possibly.
the value right now. So
we'll see where that goes. To obtain a reasonable buyout of LPs in year 15, what will be the most effective message in 2025?
I'd say understand your operating agreements, right? Usually a lot of these terms are spelled out very specifically in the operating agreement, but have open and honest conversations with your LPs as you're approaching year 15. As I mentioned, re-syndications are a big part of our strategy on our existing assets going forward. And I think as an industry, we need to place a greater emphasis on preserving our affordable housing stock. And our preference for an exit, both for us as a GP and for our LPs, is to re-syndicate out of all of our properties. And if we could do so at year 15, we may only have to invest $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 per unit. But if we have to wait until year 20, year 25, so on and so forth, those costs increase, right, as the general condition of the assets deteriorates over time and hasn't had that many replacement reserves put into it. And so we might have to invest $40,000 or $50,000 per unit the further down the timeline we go. And at that point, you then have developers who are willing just to wait out the extended use periods and wait until the rent restrictions burn off. But I'd say get in front of it, right? When year 15 is approaching, generally whether or not your LP wants to get out at that point in time, and you should know what your documents say to value the partnership interests.
Yeah, I would say if you don't know until you're 10 to 15 what it says about year 15, you've really failed as a general partner. Our strategy from, we're going to be 35 years old next year. Our strategy from day one has been to negotiate with our investor during the LOI process, which is probably a year before year 15 even starts, is what's it going to look like in year 15? So I really think that's something you really need to get way ahead of. Our business plan has always been to retain the housing and keep it affordable in perpetuity. And we've probably purchased investor interest now on well over 100 developments that we were the original developer on. So negotiate it right up front. Ask your investor, what are you counting on in year 15 in your internal rate of return computation? And if your plan is to try to get them out at a discount or bargain price, and they tell you we're factoring in X in that IRR, you're not going to get it for some discounted price. You need to really understand what year 15 and how that's driving your investor's initial investment in that development.
Okay. Another question about cutting construction costs. Are there any efforts, or have you made any efforts to utilize modular housing to cut down on rising construction costs?
We've done some panelization, which has really not been a cost decrease, but has helped us on time. And again, if you can build faster and stop the clock on your interest and other building costs, that helps. We've looked at modular, but we just haven't gotten comfortable with a modular product to put our brand on over the long term. We're still, even if it's just panelization, it's still kind of the stick frame built that's stood the test of time.
But Jeff, we're much the same way. We've done some panelization. I would throw out there too, there's some really interesting 3D printing technologies out there these days. I don't think they're quite perfected yet. And Jeff, I think that's well said, right? At least not to the point where it's something we'd be willing to put our name on at the end of the day. That's a good way to look at it. But we're getting there, right? The technology continues to improve, and hopefully we can bring the cost down, and hopefully that helps solve at least part of our affordable housing supply issue.
We've taken this step from panelization to full wall builds with window assembly being delivered to the site. So kind of feels like a baby step as we rely on that factory to build things. The thing we know for sure is from a true cost standpoint. So if your question is how are we using this to drive costs down, I'm not sure we're there yet at all. There is definitely an ability to get to a cost structure that's better, but only in a very high cost market. Or in a place where you're in a high cost market and using Davis-Bacon wages or some other prevailing wage standard.
That's a great point, Tim.
Yeah, I think we get there. I actually think we're on the way, but and I give a lot of credit to those who are forging that way with those factories and that factory ownership, because what they absolutely produce is a high quality piece of a building. And there's just no doubt about the fact that a factory built wall assembly is pretty tight and pretty reliably the same. And what we haven't experienced yet is what it's like to own that thing later. We're early enough in the process to have a curiosity about that, because I think from an airtightness, from a pure how well constructed is this factory built component or this building that's an assembly of them. I'm eager to know that.
I visited a prefab housing apartment construction place in Las Vegas when I was at the Urban Land Institute conference this last fall. And, it was very interesting and it's very cost effective, but it's also, as the other panels here were talking about, it's kind of limited because currently they only make one size of unit. And I think it was like 361 square feet or something like that. So it's very tiny. So the use for it was, certain like military installations or senior places. And now they're working on the technology to build bigger units. And So like a lot of this discussion, it's got interesting potential, but we're still not at the point where the technology would allow us to use it for kind of a more widespread basis. But it's as the technology improves, this could be something that would be helpful going forward.
Okay, and on that note, I think we are out of time. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. We'll try to respond to it separately. But in any case, thank you all again for attending. We will be sending you all a link when the recording is available. If you enjoyed this webinar, do keep an eye out for communications on our upcoming MHN Voices as well as CPE Voices webinars. So MHN Voices for multifamily and CPE Voices for commercial real estate issues coming in the new year. And thank you all to all of our speakers once again for a very interesting discussion today. And happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you all.